I hear the angels singing, hallelujah, na na. Whoa, yes. So tell me, how far am I from Cain or beat? No, don't beat. Oh, how far am I from Canaan? Well, the angels singing and the joy bell ringing and glory. Tell me, how far am I from Canaan? 'Cause over there I'ma shout troubles over. Over there I'll shout my troubles over. Well, now the angels singing and the joy bell ringing and glory. Tell me, how far am I from Canaan? 'Cause over there I'll meet my Father. Over there I'll meet my Father. Well, now the angels singing and the joy bell ringing and glory. Tell me, how far am I from Canaan? 'Cause over there I'll shout troubles over. Over there I'll shout troubles over. Well, now angels singing and the joy bell ringing and glory. Tell me, how far am I from Canaan? 'Cause over there I'll meet my mother. Over there I'll meet my mother. Well, now the angels singing and the joy bell ringing and glory. Tell me, how far am I from Canaan? Is that all right? I can imagine slaves were singing that song, a song like that, in January 1863, January 1864, 1865. Freedman was singing it in 2013. Today I want to give you an overview of what we'll be looking at over the next four sessions. This first session I have actually entitled Rehearsal for Reconstruction. And I take that title from a book written by Willie Lee Rose more than 40 years ago, entitled Rehearsal for Reconstruction, the Port Royal Experiment. The Port Royal Experiment. You know, one of the things about studying history is that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as you've heard me say before, to study history unless we in some way can relate it to our lives today. Just before we got started, what's your name? Give us
Mark.
Mark and I were talking. Mark said, you know, this is Reconstruction, and aren't we in Reconstruction all over again? In many ways, what we see happening in Raleigh, what we see happening in Washington, D.C., is reminiscent of what happened 150 years ago in this state and in this country. The similarities are there. So we talk about the first Reconstruction. Historians have already agreed that there indeed was a second Reconstruction that began somewhere around 1954 and ended around 1980. There's even talk now about the third Reconstruction that began in 2009 with the election of Barack Obama. That remains to be seen, but indeed we can really say that the first Reconstruction that occurred between 1865 and 1877 and the one that occurred between 1954 and 1970 was similar in many, many ways. Not that history repeated itself, but we see so many similarities between those two events in American history. I want to go ahead and get started with some factual information here that I think we definitely need to know as we try to understand what Reconstruction was all about. I mean, the term Reconstruction itself, what does it imply?
Building over.
Rebuilding. Why was it necessary to rebuild?
Something was broken.
Broken, and who broke it? Who broke it specifically? Has it always been broken? Was it broken in 1775?
Yes.
Was it broken in 1788, 1789?
Depends upon who you are.
Yes.
I think what you're trying to get at was there was no agreement on the part of the founders of the country as to what should happen with the Negroes and the 3/5 compromise that was in the Constitution. The North and the South couldn't agree on how black people should be treated, or I should say African American people should be treated, because the South's economy was very much based on plantation, and the Northern economy was based on manufacturing.
And banking.
Well, I think one thing we can agree is that there have been many, many problems, many issues. But to be more specific, when we get down to 1861, for those of you who were with us last spring, I mean, it was a discussion about the Civil War. Is that right? It was 1861 is a very, very important date in the history of the United States, because that's the point at which this breach comes about. It's the point at which the South decided that it was time to pull away from the nation. And that's a break. So the break that we're talking about now was the break that occurred in 1861, and a need to mend that break. And so there's a need for Reconstruction. But it didn't start in 1865. It actually started as soon as the break occurred. You know, Mr. Lincoln, as we talked about before, really believed that the war would come to an end in about 90 days. Right? He believed it would end in 90 days because he never referred to it as a war. It was a what?
Rebellion.
It was an insurrection. It was a rebellion. If you use the word war, you lend legitimacy to another nation. If you say we're at war with the Confederate States of America, it means that you've already conceded that it is another nation, the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. But the CSA, in the eyes of Mr. Lincoln, was not another nation. It was a group of hotheads who had gotten together and decided that it was time to pull away from the nation, based primarily, and I think that based on our readings last year, when we talked about why the Civil War occurred, if you look at what the Southerners themselves said about why they were pulling out, the answers would be there. And that answer comes with, when you look at each state's desire and the reason for pulling out, and it was tied to the institution of slavery. So in 1861, the break is there. And very quickly after Mr. Lincoln saw that this thing was not going to end overnight, the pressures upon him to do something about the issue of slavery, the questions about bringing the nation back together again, were bombarding him very, very early. That brings us to November 7th, 1861. We all know the Confederate States, right? Can we name all 11 of the Confederate States? We know them, starting with the northernmost state. Virginia.
North
Carolina.
South Carolina.
Georgia, Florida, Alabama,
Mississippi, Texas,
Arkansas, Texas,
Louisiana. Not Maryland.
People who live in Maryland really believe that they were not in the South, but they were really in the South. They are in the South, but most of them think that they're not, Southerners. They did not pull out, but they were one of the border states. So did we name all 11 of them? Did you get them? Starting with the northernmost, we have Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, coming around to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas. You have 11? Sure, 11. Okay. The border states, we know those. Kentucky, Maryland,
Missouri,
No, West Virginia was not.
Missouri,
Kansas.
not yet. Come on.
Missouri,
Missouri. We have Kentucky, Delaware. Oh yes, Delaware. Maryland. No.
Western Territory.
So we're looking at 15 states that were considered slave states, 11 of which actually pulled out of the United States.
How did Delaware get in there? That's a little bit strange.
Well, you know, every colony, all 13 of the colonies legalized the institution of slavery except Vermont. Right? As a matter of fact, Massachusetts was the very, very first colony to legalize slavery. Not Virginia. Not Maryland. 1641, Massachusetts legalized African slavery. Virginia was the second colony to do it, followed by Maryland, and then the Carolinas. And then as each colony was born, 1681, Pennsylvania, and of course the very, very last colony, Georgia, 1732, legalized the institution of slavery.
So all 13, because Vermont wasn't the one of the original colonies.
No, well, Vermont actually did not become a colony state until, well, colony, 17. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that would be the one that did not. Well, so we're looking at a situation here where most of the states, colonies have legalized the institution, and they don't really begin to end slavery until after the American Revolution. The revolutionary fervor began the process of abolitionism. And of course, Massachusetts being the first to actually abolish slavery, followed by Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. Some did it almost immediately, some did it on of course, on a gradual basis, meaning that slavery would end for an individual once they turned 18 years of age, in the case of New York and New Jersey, and some of the other colonies. But by 1826, and by the way, it wasn't until 1848 that the very, very last northern state abolished slavery. That was Connecticut, 1848. 1848. And they had a total of 17 slaves when they abolished slavery. For the most part, they were used as servants because they had chattel slavery in Connecticut. That was pretty much reserved for the South. So November 7th, 1861, just so that you know exactly where slavery is. And the next time I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation so that you can actually see this stuff. I think some people really like to see, the maps and the information in general. But on November 7th, 1861, after the war was still raging on, there was an attempt to really take South Carolina. I mean, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. You had wealthy people in Beaufort, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was very, very strategically located. You had the Sea Islands along South Carolina, not only South Carolina, but even North Carolina, Georgia, and all the way down to Florida, referred to as the Sea Islands. Well, there's a place called Port Royal, South Carolina. Now, on November 7, 1861, Commodore S.F. DuPont actually commanded commander of the Navy, the group actually went in and bombarded that area. And the next day, troops actually hit the ground. And before the troops actually hit the ground, everyone in Beaufort, South Carolina, all the whites, left that area. All of them except one white man. And the reason he didn't leave is because he was a bit too drunk. But the Navy tells us that there was one person left there. Everybody left. We're talking about mansions, food on the stove. They carried their servants with them. They left 10,000 slaves behind. They made it over to the mainland. Right? The big question, and so Commodore DuPont is actually standing at the crossroads because he's not a babysitter. What do you do with all of these slaves? Well, people began rolling into that area after hearing that Southerners had abandoned that area. So they had abandoned those mansions, and they were able to actually burn up hundreds and hundreds of acres of cotton that was still in the fields, and bales of cotton that had actually already been processed. But for the most part, they left everything there. And so abolitionists, who in many cases had never come into contact with a black person, are now moving into Beaufort, South Carolina, coming into contact with these people for whom they had been fighting for decades. And you have so many different groups coming in. You have philanthropists, you have missionaries, you have the abolitionists of many stripes, you have different religions coming in, trying to decide, what was best for these thousands of people. And as it turns out, those individuals in Washington, people like Thaddeus Stevens, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania, Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts, and Benjamin Wade, and Henry Davis, and others decided that something had to be done to rectify an old problem, and that problem was slavery. And there were many in Congress who believed that slavery should come to an end immediately, and that the best course of action for these 10,000 people was freedom. You absolutely give them freedom. Yes, ma'am.
Somehow I missed what prompted them to leave.
The Navy was there.
What did the Navy? Just their presence itself?
No, they were bombarded. They were shooting. They were afraid that they would be killed by these folks. What would you do if someone were to come into Durham and just began bombarding Durham? You would make an exit. You would retreat. And so now remember, they're actually the Port Royal Sound is like a little island. So these people are actually moving from that point to the mainland, and obviously to seek shelter. Well, as it turns out, the course of action by March of 1862 was that the federal government is going to protect these people. And how do you protect them? You give them freedom, but more than that, you give them the economic infrastructure for survival. And what is the economic infrastructure that you put in place for survival? Land. You got to have land. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say y'all free and not give them the means of making a living. And so all of you are familiar with the concept, 40 acres and a mule. This is where it actually began, in 1862. Field Order number 15, the Port Royal Experiment. Field Order number 15. Field Order number 15 was issued by General Sherman. This is a part of his quest to see to it that these people are given freedom, but they're given the economic means to survive. So now remember, this is 1862. The field order does not come about until March, until 1865. So what is happening between March of 1862 and when the war comes to an end in 1865 is the transition from slavery for these 10,000 people, the transition from slavery to freedom. And how do you actually do this? You know, one of the things that we know in hindsight is that Reconstruction overall was a failure because there was no preparation for the ending of slavery. Nobody began in 1859, 1860, this preparation for the ending of slavery. It happened all of a sudden.
And 10,000 people, is that the population from all the slave states?
No, it's
Port Royal.
for that particular area.
Just in that particular
Yeah.
area?
Yeah, in that Port Royal, yeah, in that area. Actually, you'll find that land, about 400,000 acres of land, 400,000 acres were confiscated from the Confederates along the Sea Islands all the way down to Florida. Now, so the 40 acres and the mule concept is you give them 40 acres and the means to cultivate the land. And that has pretty much stuck with us, you know, all these years. So I want you to let that marinate while I go back and talk about a couple other things. You know, Abraham Lincoln, as I said earlier, really did not want this war, not by any means. Did everything in his powers to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. As a matter of fact, he never looked at those Southerners as someone to hate. You know, they were still Americans in his view. So, in 1862, he comes up with a plan to allow the Confederate States to come back into the Union. And he refers to it as the 10% plan. And what it said essentially was that if 10% of the voters of 1860 in a particular state would take an oath of allegiance to the United States government, then that state could come back into the Union and all of its delegates reseated in Washington. All right? Pretty easy. All you have, if 100,000 people voted in North Carolina in 1860, find 10,000. Raise the right hand. And that state comes back into the Union. And you can imagine people in his own administration and folks in Congress said he must have bumped his head. that definitely this is too easy. You know, after a year, how many people had died? Thousands and thousands of people. So we need to be more vigilant. We need to be more punishing than this. And so there was tremendous opposition to Lincoln's 10% plan. And it came into Congress. Benjamin Wade and Davis, actually 2 years later in 1864, were able to get through one house of Congress what was called the Wade-Davis Bill. And some Southerners referred to it as an ironclad oath. And this is what he wanted. He said, first of all, you're going to have to abolish slavery in your state if you want to become a part of the United States. Right? That's number one. Number two, he stated that if you want to hold office in your new government and you were a former office holder, you will never be able to. In other words, if you were a Confederate office holder, you will not be able to hold office in your state. You cannot be a legislator. Surely you cannot be governor of the state. All right. So we're going to make it very, very difficult for you as a member of the Confederacy administration, one of the big boys, to ever hold office again in your state. Mm-hmm.
But why did any of the states want to come back to the Union? I thought the point was they didn't. So
Well,
why set a standard that they have to attain in order to be in the Union?
Well, you know, when the states actually decided they would join the Confederacy, not everyone in that state wanted to pull out. I mean, in North Carolina, the vote had to be taken twice. You know, two referenda were held in the state. And in the case of Maryland, they didn't pull out, but the vote was pretty close because your legislature would decide whether or not you would join the Confederacy. In the state of North Carolina, two referenda were held. That is, the people of North Carolina voted to actually have a convention to decide whether or not they would secede from the Union. And so, you had Unionists actually living in all of these southern states. So it was a tremendous amount of divisiveness among the people in all of these states. But if you're a state like Georgia, like Alabama, and you look around in 1862 and 1863, 1864, and you're losing, a lot of the people are being killed, then you want this thing to come to an end. And so there were those individuals who actually pressed Confederate leaders to put their arms down. And so essentially, by the time we get to 1864, and all of the assets that you found in the North, and what were those assets that we talked about last year? They had a population of almost 23 million. How many million people were there in the South? How many?
9.
Yeah, about 9.5 million, of whom 4 million were slaves. So you only have 22,900,000 in the North. In terms of railroads, the North had 9 times the railroad mileage that the South had. Banking capital on hand. The North had far more. And so all of these assets that you find in the North really began to take over as the war continued. And so there were many Southerners who said, let's bring this thing to an end. So if you want to come back into the Union, this is what you're going to have to do. And of course, the ironclad oath or the Wade-Davis Bill did not make it to the president's desk, and even if it had made it to the president's desk, he would have vetoed it.
At the time, was there a veto-proof majority in this Congress, though? I mean, there's a lot of Republicans in that,
Right.
and they could have basically overridden their own president's party's veto, right?
1864, I'm not sure. We do know in 1865 and 1866.
Happened a bunch, but
Yeah.
okay.
By 1866, 1867, how many times did they override Johnson's veto? Of course, we'll talk about those vetoes. But as early as 1866, when President Johnson succeeds President Lincoln, there's this huge battle between the president and the so-called radical Republicans. and they are able to override his veto many times, to the extent that they placed the South under military rule in 1867. And of course, the South was under military rule for 10 years, from 1867 until 1877. Well, any other questions? Yes.
I understood in 1861 that the population voted to not secede. Was it to vote for referendum or to stay in the Union? Did the population vote on staying in the Union or secession or to have a referendum?
For North Carolina?
Mhm.
Yeah, they actually, you had the vote, the referendum, to determine whether or not you have a convention, right? And you have elected officials to go to Raleigh to vote. And then the first one, of course, did not pass, and then so you had another one, and it squeaked by the second time. It varied from state to state as to whether or not you had a referendum or, legislature actually voted.
So the referendum would mean the population wanted to secede basically and wanted to have the referendum to ratify that secession. Is that?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The big thing is getting the referendum. Like, for example, in 1776, when North Carolina's Constitution was written after the Revolution began, it was so conservative that it didn't even leave room for amendment. Right? It was the most conservative of all of the states in North Carolina, in the United States. It was the most conservative Constitution. And that Constitution was in place from 1776 until 1835. 1835. Now, what happened in 1835 was that finally the legislature gave it to the people to determine whether or not a referendum would be held or would be called to actually allow the legislature, to allow a convention to be called to rewrite the Constitution. And it didn't take very long for the Constitution to be rewritten, a few months, but it took from 1776 to 1835 to get the legislature to actually call for a referendum to look at the Constitution. And that's why, this state goes down as one of the most conservative. And, of course, we didn't get veto. The governor didn't get veto power in the state until just a few years ago. It was 20 years ago, 1992, I think it was. All 49 states, all 49 states had veto power. The governor had veto power. So it goes down as being very conservative.
I was curious, in early 1860s in the South, who was eligible to vote? White, men, was there any property or income requirement, or?
Yeah, actually, property qualifications were killed in the 1835 Constitution. 1835 Constitution did some good things and some bad things. For example, 1835 Constitution, under the 1776 Constitution, free black men could vote providing they owned a certain amount of property. White men could vote providing they owned a certain amount of property. You had to own a certain amount of property if you were planning to run for a legislator. If you were running for a governor, obviously you had to own a lot of land. A lot of land. I mean, that's why, for example, you have wealthy governors, people who were deemed wealthy at that time. I guess we have people today. Although some things have changed, a lot has not changed.
I think I read somewhere, it was 1970, only 39% of adults in North Carolina had high school diplomas. So I'm wondering about 1860s, how many white men had high school diplomas? Or figured high schools.
Well, let me give you this little bit of information. We were known as the Rip Van Winkle State. In 1808, the Raleigh Star, a newspaper over in Raleigh, did a survey and found out that only about 8% of North Carolinians could read and write. And that the state itself suffered from judicial lag, social lag, political lag, inertia, like no other state. And you know, we have this very, very long history of being behind the rest of the country in so many of these indices. John Spencer Bassett, a professor at Duke University, wrote an article, and he compared Booker T. Washington to a great general in the South. And who was the greatest general in the South? Robert E. Lee. And Bassett said that, without a doubt, you know, Booker T. Washington was on par with Robert E. Lee. Well, he'd also written that one of the reasons why North Carolina was so backward was because of the people who settled North Carolina back in the 1660s. These were people who had come over from Virginia. They were essentially debtors. They had been in prison, didn't have any money. Compare that with the people who settled South Carolina and Georgia, especially South Carolina. These were people who had come over from Barbados. They were wealthy planters. They brought their slaves with them. North Carolina only imported about 3,000 slaves during the whole period of slavery, that is directly from Africa and the West Indies. South Carolina imported 38% of all Africans who came into the United States. 38%. So South Carolina, even though you might not know it today, South Carolina absolutely was by far, you know, one of the richest, surely a leading, not only state just in the South, but in the nation. Charleston, South Carolina, up until the 1830s and 40s, was the largest city in the South. Boston was the largest city in the North. So South Carolina had that tremendous edge. North Carolina was always looked at. And then we fast forward to 2014, and some historians are making those comparisons still when we look at so many of the indicators. In terms of education, I think we've gone down to like 47, 48 in education in the last 5 years. And then, you know, when the Governor Perdue said a few years ago, we're even lower than Mississippi. You know, and the governor of Mississippi said, what do you mean lower than Mississippi? She had to apologize. Like, you know, Mississippi is the lowest. And when you go below Mississippi, I mean, it's just the abyss. I had to go here first and then come here and then go.
The second referendum succeeded in getting a convention, right?
Exactly.
When the convention met, what was the vote on secession?
It was, yes, we will secede.
What was the percentage?
I'm not sure about the exact percentage at this point. Yeah.
Was it pretty even?
It was tight. It wasn't like you're going to have 50%, 80% versus 20%. It was still close. And even though North Carolina becomes is the 12th state last state to actually pull out of the Union, is absolutely the state that put most into the Civil War. More people died from North Carolina than any other state.
Per capita or real?
In real.
Real.
Yeah, numbers were extremely high. So it gave itself 100, but we're slow to get out. But we will give you 110%. Let me go to here, then here, and then over there.
You were talking about, way back, about Reconstruction and how surprising it was in the late 1850s that there was no plan in place to think about what to do with freed slaves. Was there enough thought at that time that the slaves were going to be free, come a Civil War or no Civil War, that the slaves were going to be free? And then, so then why would they have a plan?
Yep, right, exactly right. And the other thing is that because there was no plan meant that we were where we were in 1865.
Right.
1875.
But the conditions in the 50s didn't allow the thought that we needed a plan.
Exactly. You're right.
So
You're right.
the environment wasn't right to.
You're exactly right. But we still can say that had there been a plan in place, if there had been
Right,
some,
if.
it's always if in history.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And then we go right here.
I didn't want to get off the subject, but the quote that you gave of that Professor Bassett made, he got into a lot of trouble for that.
Yeah, he did.
Quote at Duke University almost caused the Bassett affair, and he almost lost his job at Duke.
He did lose his job. As a matter of fact, they burned him in effigy.
I thought that he actually was able to stay, that the faculty,
No, he voted him out. And he left North Carolina.
okay. I know he went to, I think Wellesley, but I thought that he had actually made a mistake.
I just had a student to write a master's thesis on him about 6 years ago.
Well, we're gonna have to set Eugene Brown straight. He lives in his house. He thinks that he stayed.
No, he stayed around. They absolutely, if someone burns you in effigy
Yeah.
right there on the campus, it means that it's time for you. Whether they fire you or not, I would be afraid to walk the campus.
What was it he said? I'm sorry.
He compared, he said several things that were anti-South. What he did, the first thing he did was to actually say that North Carolinians were backward. Now, he was not from North Carolina. He was from, I think he's from New Jersey, maybe. I'm not sure exactly. He's from some northern state. But he said that North Carolinians were backward because of the people who actually settled in North Carolina. These were poor people who didn't have any money. They never engaged in commerce. Well, when is it that North Carolina really begins to engage in commerce? I mean, we had this jagged coastline out there. So, why is it that just off the coast of North Carolina is known as what?
Graveyard of the Atlantic.
Graveyard of the Atlantic. One of the reasons we didn't have very many Africans coming in by way of the trade is because of that jagged coastline. But even more than that, the people in North Carolina didn't have money. And for example, in 1790, there were only 3 plantations in North Carolina with more than 100 slaves, according to the U.S. Census. You look at Georgia, founded in 1732, had more than that. Surely South Carolina, Virginia had far more than that. When you look at the number of slaves on individual units of production, surprisingly, in 1790, in North Carolina, it was only 5 slaves. The average number of slaves on an individual unit of production on a plantation or farm was only 5. So, this idea that you have huge numbers of slaves on plantations, not in North Carolina. You did in South Carolina. You did in Virginia. You did in Mississippi for the most part. In North Carolina, slavery was not as big. Chris, let me go to here first. And then.
I was just going to say about the referendum and the conventions, it's like many of the Southern conventions early on were conservative and they had moderate unionists, they called them conditional unionists. But in the 3 months from January to April, you saw a big sliding as the center disintegrated and more people moved to the edge, reacting to the events.
Exactly.
So that you can have a vote in January that is conservative and unionist, but the way the people act back in April is totally different
Exactly.
from what it was when they were elected.
It's a good point, because what happens in April of 1861 is the firing on Fort Sumter. Right? Firing on Fort Sumter. And that, because actually prior to the firing on Fort Sumter, there were only 7 states, right? Only 7 states had seceded. And they met in Montgomery back in February. And then 4 other states seceded after firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. So, people were not stagnant. They were fluid. Okay, we go here first and then Chris.
Regarding the withdrawal of several states, a couple things that I have read. Number one, that the movement in North Carolina that you're just talking about 19 or 20% of people in North Carolina own slaves. The other thing that I have heard argued about that a lot is that what pushed not only North Carolina but also Virginia over the line when they were very close was Lincoln's call to raise troops to put down the rebellion, and that pushed a whole lot of people who would otherwise have opposed secession into it.
You're very correct. As a matter of fact, when the firing on Fort Sumter occurred, what did Mr. Lincoln do the next day? He called for 75,000 volunteers. And Southerners said, oh my God, that's an act of aggression. In their eyes, it was an act of aggression because, Southerners did not go north to fight. Right? So it was a northern, they looked at it as a northern attack upon them. Just leave us alone. We want to take all your forts. And then just leave us alone. We don't want to come into Washington, D.C. I think they could have taken Washington, D.C. in 1862 after the Battle of Shiloh. But it was a northern offensive and a southern defensive war. So, it was not the will of the people to wage war against the North. That's a very good point.
Go one step further, big what ifs. I've always thought that had Lincoln, when the first group voted to secede, had he done what you were suggesting, just left people alone and said, well, I'm sorry you're leaving, so long, if you ever want to come back, we'll welcome you with open arms as long as you abolish slavery. But in the meantime, we're not going to support you in trade or anything else. Would have collapsed, wouldn't it?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, nobody knows.
No.
I've always thought it's interesting speculation.
Yeah, it is.
A million fewer people would have died.
Yeah. It's like,
picking on your point about the percentages, I'm trying to remember from Dr. Gershonhorn's History of North Carolina class. I thought in the 1860 census, 72% of North Carolinians owned no slaves.
You're right.
And so it's only 28 that did. And what I want to ask you is, where did that fall on the scale in the South? Was that fairly representative?
Representative.
3/4 of most Southerners not own slaves?
According to the 1860 census, 25% of the white population in the South owned slaves.
Across the board from Texas.
Across the board, all across, 25%. So, in case of North Carolina, 72. So you're right there in the same group. So 75% of whites did not own slaves, but that 25% controlled each of the states. They controlled the South. They were the legislators, they were the governors, they were everything. They were the
property.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, if you have to remember that in 28% of those individuals owned slaves, but some of them, by the time we get to the 1860s, owned 5,000 acres of land, 10,000 acres of land. People who live in northern Orange County today, people who live in Alamance County, folks who live out in Halifax County today are third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generations of tremendous landholding. That old money that goes way back. And we won't even talk about head rights. Those people who were actually given land to come settle in the colonies, given 100 acres of land. And the residual of that money, the residuals are still being played out right here in North Carolina, right here in Durham County today, right here in Orange County, in Wake County. Still being played out. What was another question? Okay.
Just a cynical comment. Even today, we struggle with an honest vote. Imagine the voting in the South. If I have 100 employees, I tell them who to vote for. You're going to vote for the white man. You're going to vote this way, that way. They're not really going to disagree. They have no job. It's pretty. There's no board of elections, no verification. I mean, we're still struggling with it now. It's sort of embarrassing for the country.
Right. Yeah, it is.
So I don't put much validity in that rule.
Yeah. So by the time we get to 1864, this is actually, we're still talking about Reconstruction because Reconstruction becomes a part of the vernacular as early as 1862 with Lincoln's 10% plan. 1864, the Ironclad Plan. So there's going to be a showdown in Washington as to who should control Reconstruction. Is it going to be the executive with his 10% plan? And of course, when he died, when he was assassinated in April of 1865, he succeeded by Johnson. Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, right? Moved to Tennessee. He's a Democrat. He hates people who own property. He just didn't like people who were wealthy. And he comes up with several plans, and he comes up with a majority plan. His majority plan says the same thing as Lincoln's. If a majority of the voters of 1860 would take an oath of allegiance to the U.S., then that state could come back into the Union. And this, of course, this is in the spring of 1865. So there are efforts to deal with this issue. And then we come around to 1865. And as we've talked about before, by the time we get to March and April and May of 1865, the war is winding down, the war is over, and the Emancipation Proclamation that had been signed back in 1863, of course, only freed a few people back in 1863, 1864. An executive order is issued in 1865. And that's the order that is being read by the generals and the colonels and other people as they went from plantation to plantation. And they're reading to them that y'all are free. That's the order that has been given by the president. That's the executive order that was actually written by President Lincoln saying that slavery should come to an end. And the South was devastated by war. The South needed to be reconstructed. I mean, when you talk about the physical devastation, remember that the war is being carried out down here. So it needed to be reconstructed. But not only does it need to be reconstructed physically, that the human population had to be reconstructed. And we're talking about tremendous upheaval. We're talking about separation of families. Black families, white families, 700,000 people almost are dead by 1865. Social dislocation. So Reconstruction actually took on so many different faces as early as March of 1865. So the field order that I talked about earlier, Sherman's field order, is actually issued in March of 1865. And that is, these individuals now have this land. These 10,000 people who in 1862 had been given the land. This is your land now to cultivate. Right? Well, because of all this social dislocation and upheaval and destruction, Congress says something has to be done. And so on March 3rd, 1865, Congress established what was called the Freedmen's Bureau. It had another name like, the Bureau of Refugees, Abandoned Lands. The abandoned lands, of course, we're talking about are those lands along the sea islands. And so Congress says something has to be done to deal with the problems facing all of these folks, black and white, in the South. And so this Freedmen's Bureau was one of the best things when it was established to actually come along. March 3rd, 1865. 4 major objectives. Number one, people were hungry. So the Bureau actually gave out more than 40,000 rations of food in those early days to people throughout the South, black and white. In addition to that, hospitals had to be constructed. Some 40 hospitals were established throughout the South. There's a hospital in Washington, D.C. today it was called Freedman's Hospital. Anybody familiar with that?
I used to work there.
You used to work there, right? Okay. They changed the name now. What is it now? Is it
Howard University.
Howard? Okay. Freedman's Hospital. It's one of those original hospitals. But in addition to having to deal with the fact that people are dying from diseases and from wounds in battle, black folks themselves in 1865, can you imagine being on a plantation, you're 20 years of age, and you have never read anything in your life? Imagine being 75 years of age, and all of the laws in North Carolina dating back to 1715 made it unlawful for you to read or write. And now you have been told that you are free. And, you know, I was reading some stories this morning about, they were written by white women who were really outraged at how their slaves were acting. And that these were uppity, they had gotten uppity, and they were talking back, and they were sassy, you know. And it was difficult for them to deal with that. But now you're free and you are saying, and I expect them licking out their tongues at their former masters and doing all kinds of things. But the day of Jubilee has now arrived. And it appears that, you know, if you were coming out of slavery in 1865, what would you want? You think about it, you know, from your vantage point. Being on a plantation all those years, and now you're free. And even the owner is saying, well, you all can leave if you want to, but I can tell you one thing, you'll never come back here. Well, what do you do? I mean, in some cases, you've never been any more than 2 or 3 miles from the house. You don't know what's over the hill. So your connection to the outside world is limited, so what do? Even though you now have this new so-called freedom. But there were desires. What would be those desires, you think? What was number one? Education is one.
Reconnect with family.
Huh?
To reconnect with your
To
family.
reconnect with family.
It's more basic. I mean, food is what comes to mind. The blacks and the whites were starving.
That's right.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
just basic survival.
But the extent to which people were looking for family members is incredible. Absolutely incredible. Folks are going near and far looking for family members. We've already talked about runaway slaves, and the primary reason for running away was not to get to the north, but to what? Find family members. That was number one. You don't run away to Georgia to find freedom. You don't run away over to Texas looking for freedom. It must be your wife or a husband or some member of the family. So Heather Williams just wrote a book, published about 3 years ago, and titled something like "Looking for Their Kin." And she chronicles, you know, all of those. She looks at all those sources in 1865 and thereafter. Former slaves are writing letters to former slave owners, asking them where they possibly sold members of the family 20 years ago. I know you sold my son in 1849. Can you tell me where he possibly may have been sold? Former slaves are actually advertising in the newspapers 10 years ago, in 1858, I lost my mother. She was description. And if you have any information about where she may be. So folks are looking for their loved ones. They want to get an education. They want land. I mean, all those things that you named, people absolutely want in 1865. And the bottom line is how do you get that? Because remember, even though freedom is there was no preparation for it, so you're kind of out there on your own, or you go back and you live on the plantation. You're at the crossroads. Do I go north? Will I be accepted there? Do I go west? Do I actually leave the country? And all of those, they did all of those. They went west, they went north, they left the country. But most stayed where? Right, on the plantations.
I'd like to kind of explore what this common suffering, black and white, meant in terms of what might be called human solidarity in the South, as contrasted with what was going on up north, who had not experienced nothing like that kind of loss. What was unique about black and white relationships when it came to this being, as awful as it was, home? In spite of all the common suffering, this is what we know. This is where we grew up. I think that's often misunderstood.
It is. It's a very good question. And I think that the best answers are given to us by people who actually live. You know, we don't have to speculate. We just read what is survived in terms of blacks and whites writing about their experience. And in reading letters just in the last few weeks of both blacks and whites, you know, what stood out is that human element. Even though there were race riots that occurred in 1865 and 1866, even though there was fighting among blacks and whites, there was a level of solidarity that occurred between former slaves and former slave masters that's almost unbelievable. Where a man or a former slave tells his master or his mistress that I left in 1865, but I'm back now. And I'm asking you if you will allow me to work. And one response was, yes, I will, and I will pay you based on how well the crops come in. So, you know, I think what we've done, you know, it's more glamorous to talk about politics. It may be more glamorous to talk about the military expeditions. It may be, you know, more glamorous to talk about the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, Civil Rights Bill. But what I've tried to get at, you know, are those stories of people who had to live through all of that. You know, get away from Raleigh, get away from Washington, get away from the politics, and deal with the fact that people had to deal with this on a daily basis. And the big question is, who were these people and what are their stories? And what are their life experiences in the mountains of North Carolina in 1866? Now, how do we get at a former slave in Bertie County in 1866? What is that mistress on that big plantation saying about whatever it is that happened? And the sad reality is that we don't have the kind of surviving records that we like to have. It's because people don't write, because they couldn't write and they couldn't read. So they're not writing anything down. And so we have glimpses, you know, of the kinds of human interaction between black and white. Glimpses of it, but not to the extent, you know, that we can write a multi-volume work on it. You know, but I think about it often. You know, we talk about 1865 and go out to Bennett Place, but you don't hear very much about what was happening to the people, and that was Orange County at the time. You just don't know about what was happening to the so-called common man and common woman. You know, in 1865, folks began leaving northern Durham County, at that time Orange County, coming into what we now call the town, the city of Durham. Hayti. We see the word Hayti, H-A-Y-T-I, in 1872 for the first time, as it related to a group of black people who were living in an area that stretched all the way from what's the street downtown?
Parish Street.
Parish Street, all the way over to where NCCU is today.
Lawson?
Yeah, no, that whole area, Lawson Fair Street. So, you know, we get a glimpse into what they were doing. We know that they are establishing churches. When we read about Durham, I mean, we have glimpses. Some historians have done a great job, you know, with the history of Durham. But I think we need more of that.
Just to mention that, you know, we have a tremendous resource with Stagville Plantation, which was the longest slave plantation in North Carolina with 900 enslaved people. And my daughter worked there last summer and found in the closet actually some interviews that had been done in the 1970s, interviewing the descendants of slaves that had lived at Stagville. And these are people, some of them who had been slaves, but others that then became sharecroppers. And she digitized them, and so now they are available at Stagville, these interviews. But I listened to some of them. What I think we have to remember is that, too, that a lot of these people, they did stay on and live at Stagville, but they were still very poor. And while the Benedict family may have allowed them to stay there, they still, you know, I would not say were given, you know, really what they deserved or equal opportunities. They were still very, very poor. Yeah.
Question?
In downtown Durham, there's downtown Raleigh, the North Carolina Historical Archives. I'm not sure exactly what it's called.
Kristen, Eric can tell you exactly what it's called. They've
done research that.
Okay. So I had the opportunity to look at some documents there related to the Civil War, and it was just fascinating. These letters from family members to their legislators saying, please end this. This is what happened to my child, you know, and these are the conditions that the soldiers are fighting under and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if there's any Reconstruction related similar kind of letters.
Oh, yes, there are. Yeah. You can actually go online and see many of those letters. Because as we'll talk about, as Reconstruction gets underway, you're going to have all of these agents coming from the north, coming down into the southern states. These are Freedman's Bureau agents, and they're parked over in Raleigh because another objective of the Freedman's Bureau, I gave you three.
Two.
Hospitals and food. A third objective was to actually negotiate contracts between the former slaves and former slave owners. You know, so slavery has come to an end, and it's time to pay people now. Right? And you can imagine being a slave owner all those years, these folks working for you without actually paying them money. Now you have to do that. Slavery is over. So the Freedmen's Bureau, not enough agents by any stretch of imagination, but these agents are coming down into the South and they're negotiating contracts between former slaves and former slave owners. And so there is a wealth of information. The Freedmen's Bureau papers. Yes, sir.
I was struck at our last semester, whatever. One person in my discussion group said that she was from the North, and she said that in U.S. history they spent very, very little time on the Civil War.
I remember that.
And so my question is, while all this turmoil really is going on in the South, Reconstruction, and a lot of questioning, and all the contracts and all this business, what's happening to the average person in Connecticut, Boston, Pennsylvania? Do they even know what's going on? Do they have an awareness? Does life just go on, and that's another part of the world down there? Or what?
Everybody has some problems. So, they have a different set of problems going on. And they don't have the so-called black problem. But you have to understand now, in the North, there are distributed approximately 250,000 blacks living in Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts. So there are indications that the race problem is there. I mean, we have laws being passed. I mean, for example, Southerners learned how to pass segregation laws from Northerners. Right? When did it become necessary to pass a law in the South segregating black people? It didn't really occur until we get to the end of Reconstruction. Laws of segregation have not been passed between 1865 and 1875. It doesn't occur until 1881. But in Boston, in New York, and other places in the North and the Midwest, laws have already been passed segregating blacks and whites on the trains and so forth and so forth. So life was going, they were dealing with other kinds of issues and problems, but surely not the extent, they weren't dealing with the racial problem that was going on in the South. They had their own problems. So was a question, okay.
I was wondering, didn't some of the northern newspapers have correspondence coming down here?
Oh, yeah.
So there ought to be accounts of, how the slaves were taking it. And
yeah, I would venture to say that before, and many Northerners never came into contact with black people. There may be some now in some places, but surely 50, 60 years ago, there were whites who never came into contact with blacks. I mean, you have soldiers who are fighting in the Union Army, and the big question is, why are they fighting? Are they coming to the South to liberate blacks? No, they're actually fighting so that the Union will stay in place. But when they see a black person on the battlefield, may have been the very, very first time they come into contact with a black person at all. Question over you.
I was going to ask if you would please expound a little bit more about the account contracts that the people understand.
Yeah, the contracts were centered around what the basis was an element of equality, an element of not taking the advantage of. So, for example, a slave owner would meet the Freedmen Bureau agents in Raleigh or in Greensboro, and they would actually sit down and negotiate how much money he's going to have to pay his 25 slaves. Would it be 10 cents a day? Would it be 25 cents a day? What are you going to pay? It's not like you're going to bring all 25 slaves and the slave owner. You're just negotiating essentially with that master to let him know that indeed this is a new day. Now, could it be enforced? No. Not enforced at all. It was an effort, but in terms of enforcement, because it actually led to what? Sharecropping. Sharecropping actually becomes the new kind of slavery. And I think I may have shared with you that my father decided that he wanted his 3 sons to live on a farm in 1963, and we sharecropped, and it was absolutely a wonderful experience and a bad experience. Wonderful in that I learned how to work on a farm, how to milk cows, how to prime tobacco, how to suckle tobacco, do all of that. You know, get up in the barn, black snakes you weren't afraid. But the old stories that you hear today about the man saying, "We broke even, John," is essentially what the man told my father. I remember when he sold the first load of tobacco, he gave my father $300. And we had moved out into the country into a 3-room, essentially shack, with an outside toilet. We had to walk a quarter of a mile to get water for everything. And as it turns out, he gave him $300, but he had a son who was my age, and Daddy said one day, "Freddie, you know, Daddy sold the tobacco and he got $1,400. Now, I remember, I was about 10, but I knew that 300 was not happening. So, and the whole thing is you're working on what? Halves. You know, you provide the labor, he provided this, and so forth. And so my father went to him, and he said, Mr. Walter, I understand you sold, you got $1,400, and I'm supposed to get $700, right? He said, no, you remember I gave you some molasses, 5-gallon bucket of molasses. I gave you flour. I said that you could come and get a ham out of the shack anytime you wanted to. I gave you this, I gave you that. I loaned you $5. I gave you a big head sons, 50 cents a month. All it adds up. And so at the end of, I remember in November of 1963 when everything was over, he indeed told my father that, well, Bud, we broke even. We broke even. So no money actually went into his pocket. And we had left our real nice, comfortable home in Hillsborough with running water and inside toilet and all that to go out to do that. And it was, in many ways, a fiasco. But, you know, that was 1963. Imagine what it was in 1925. What it may have been like in 1875.
What prompted your father to leave?
To
move from?
Well, he was born and raised in northern Orange County. He was a farmer, you know, most of his life, and he just wanted his sons to experience. It was kind of, you know, the country was still in him, and he wanted us to experience that. And so the whole family moved out there for that 1 year. Oh, just for 1 year. My mother was, you know, she was upset every single day.
What did the Freedmen's Bureau do about education?
Okay, we'll get this. Okay, keep us on task. And the very, very last one, education. As a matter of fact, the Freedmen's Bureau, with aid from the American Missionary Association and philanthropists, built 4,239 schools throughout the South. And we're talking day schools, night schools, Sunday schools. And somebody earlier said that education definitely was one thing that slaves wanted. I mean, we have stories of 75, 80-year-old former slaves saying that I want y'all to teach me how to read this thing that we call the Bible before I die. Just this quest, you know, for knowledge, for information, because North Carolina had passed a law which forbade the teaching of reading and writing in the state. 1830 law was passed, which said that if a slave is caught reading, the first penalty is 39 lashes across the bare back. The second offense was death. And I tell students all the time, you have an opportunity to read, and do some more reading. And you're just 3 or 4 generations removed from a law which said that it's unlawful for you to read and write. You have this opportunity to read and read. And you're somewhere tweeting and twitting. On the phone. It's tragic in many ways, y'all. It really is.
Do you think maybe the Freedman Bureau and other efforts were in part to keep the unemployed where they were and not to migrate to the north?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
When I grew up in Illinois, surrounded near St. Louis, there was a large factory town, and there were no blacks that were allowed to come into the town or live there. And and what they were threatened with was their jobs, because they worked in a factory. So they could work there, and there are a lot of different steel mill plants, lots of plants. But I grew up knowing that. And
it's interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't until the civil rights that they were allowed to actually even have a house in Grant City, Illinois.
Wow.
So I'm wondering if some of these good works were really a matter of economic reasons, because I really don't get the sense that Civil War, North and South, was really as a result of humanitarian efforts.
Yeah. That brings to mind, I think that's a very good question for which I really don't have an answer. But, for example, during the 1930s, the state of North Carolina was willing to give a black student money to actually get an education out of the state of North Carolina to avoid you going to UNC, Chapel Hill, or to NC State. We will pay for your education. And it actually resulted in a U.S. Supreme Court case, Gaines versus Missouri. And in that case, of course, the Supreme Court said that if you're not going to allow Gaines to attend the University of Missouri Law School, you're going to have to establish a law school at the black school. So as a result of that Supreme Court decision in 1938, there is a law school at NCCU. There's a graduate program at NCCU.
What year?
1938. As a result of that Supreme Court decision in 1938, Gaines versus Canada versus Missouri, you have law schools and graduate programs and professional schools at HBCUs. Yes, ma'am.
I received $175 under that program.
Is that right?
But they said they didn't pay for food. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and they said, and it was in late 40, 40 and 41, that they didn't pay for food because you had to buy that anyway. And they didn't pay, they paid for your transportation to Pennsylvania.
And you're from Oklahoma?
Yeah. But anyway, I got $175.
Probably a bit of money at that time, wasn't it?
And my brother, who was in law school at Howard, got about the same amount. So we didn't get rich from that.
Yeah, no. But you couldn't go to school in Oklahoma, is that right?
No, not master's degree.
Right.
Excuse me, was that tuition or was that 175 for?
That was tuition and everything. The way they prorated it. All I remember is I got 100. I don't know how. I know they said they didn't pay for food, and they didn't pay for this, and they didn't pay for that. So.
But did you have to pay out-of-state tuition?
Yes. No, I didn't. I don't remember out of
don't think
that.
you had.
Because that was back in the 1940s, so I'm 95 now, so I can't remember all of it.
Yeah, well, I went to high school in Wilmington, and most of my teachers had graduate degrees, and they were all from Columbia, Penn, NYU. All of that was like the norm. You couldn't go to Chapel Hill or any place in this state, and they would pay. And that's why the teachers ended up with graduate degrees from northern states, because they got tuition paid, because the state institutions in this state would not admit them.
Yeah. Anywhere in the South. I mean, for example, there's a case. What case actually? If you get this answer, I'll give you 5 seconds. Which case was it that actually broke down the barrier to allow blacks to go get graduate degrees? No. Your Supreme Court decision. I tell you what, when we come back in the next time, that's your homework. Which case was it that allowed? I can tell you that folks began attending UNC Chapel Hill in the early 1950s, getting law degrees.
Paulie Martin?
Huh?
What is it, Paulie Martin?
No, it was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. What was that U.S. Supreme Court decision that brought down the walls of segregation at the graduate level?
Okay.
50 cents is about the same thing that guy gave you for working on his farm.
And 50 cents there went a long way. Oh, that was a big 16-ounce soda, potato chips, and oatmeal cake, and
well, it might be worth something if you gave us a 50-cent piece.
Let me. So those were the stipulations of the Freedmen's Bureau. We're looking at a bureau that was around, unfortunately, for only about 10 years. Eventually, they had what was called the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, where they would actually, give these low-interest loans to the former slaves. But politics, as a matter of fact, Frederick Douglass was in charge of the bank at one time, but politics actually kind of led to the demise of the Freedmen's Bureau. So we're talking about it opening the doors of education. And it was at this time that, of course, that black colleges were established. And what was the very, very first one established after slavery ended? Before Hampton. Shaw University, 1865, American Missionary Association, right down the road there. Shaw University, not only Shaw, but Howard University, named for the man who was the first director of the Freedmen's Bureau, Oliver O. Howard. Howard was established in 1867, Hampton 1869. Biddle Memorial Institute, today known as Johnson C. Smith University, 1871.
Was it first established? Like
1865. So we're talking about these schools. Some of them still in existence today. Can be traced back to the ending of the Civil War and this quest on the part of blacks to actually get an education. They knew that the avenue to greater freedoms would be through an education. So that becomes that avenue, that becomes the street to greater levels of freedom.
Was all that funded directly by federal funds, and were the people that worked in it? I know there were volunteers, missionary societies. Were the people actually like government employees that did all that?
No, as a matter of fact, most of the organizations, these were philanthropic organizations, missionary associations. So many different organizations came together, funding the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church. So many of them are actually faith-based churches, and still
they
are.
actually funded themselves. They weren't funded by the federal government,
No.
the Bureau.
No. Most of them were not. State, for example, NCCU started off as a private school, most of them. And then state actually took over in 1925. Same thing for A&T, Winston-Salem State, St. Augustine's College over in Raleigh.
So I've been through Shaw and Howard and those two also.
Do what now?
Like Shaw and Howard and the early ones of the
Yeah.
state.
All private, still private.
But Howard, if I'm not mistaken, has something, I don't know exactly how to title it, where the federal government today gives a certain amount to their budget. And so when they were established.
They do. It was federal funds.
Right, federal funds.
Yeah.
And so when they established, and they still do.
Exactly. Yes, ma'am.
My father went to Wiley College in Texas in the 1800s, and my mother's mother went to Lemoyne, and that was burned down after she finished completely and re-established after that. But we burned all the area in Mississippi in Memphis, where it was, and burned it down.
You burned it down?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I have a question going back to the Port Royal experiment.
Okay.
Did they get they didn't get the 40 acres of the mules, did they?
No, we're not gonna have time to talk about that. I like this into action, but
Well, I just wonder. I thought that you left us with the thought that they did, but it was my understanding that no, even though the agreement was signed, nobody got the 40 acres.
Well, they did get it for 3 years. But what happens is that when Johnson comes in, he returned all of that land back to the original owners.
Okay.
They lost it. Big partner?
Supreme Court case.
No. You out there working on it already? You got an iPad back there.
Google it.
Well, see, I didn't have enough sense to think about it.
As always, we've gone over. Anybody who won the game between the Panthers and San Francisco? Got advice? Somebody got advice? Well, I left the score was 10-6.
When I left Charlotte this morning, we were already lining up at the stadium.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let me share this little bit of
Panthers
different.
suffered tough loss. 23-10.
Oh, my God. Let me just share this with you because I want to finish 1865, and then when we come back next month, we'll be at 1866. All right. 1865 was critical in this way. One of the things I alluded to earlier was the fact that Southerners could not deal with the fact that slavery had come to an end. During slavery times, there was something referred to as the slave codes that we talked about before. Well, many of the southern states began to put into place what they called the black codes. And these black codes essentially adopted the slave codes and transferred them to a free population. All right? Let me give you just 3 examples of what. A black person in North Carolina, these were all passed in March of 1866. A black person in North Carolina could not testify against a white person. Right? Could not testify against whites. Another one which was really silly, if all of them were silly and crazy, but if 2 black people were negotiating the sale of a mule, a horse, goat, sheep, or whatever, and that was valued more than $10, they could not sell it unless a white person was there to actually oversee the agreement. Well, the big question, of course, is why that kind of stuff.
Did the whites get any money?
Like it didn't specify in the law. You had to have a white person present. And one that even though there were laws in place about rape, in North Carolina, a very specific law was passed which stated that if a black man raped a white woman, the penalty was, of course, death. even though there were laws already in place, but it specified color. And they began to use terms like person of color, or phrases like person of color. And a person of color, of course, could be a black person, it could be a Native American, essentially anyone who was non-white, a person of color. And it goes on and goes on and goes on with law. And for example, blacks could not hold property in some places. In some places, laws were passed where no more than 3 blacks could be on the street at the same time. Could not be on a corner on the street at the same time. Because they would be inciting a riot. And we've had those passed in the last 20 years. They were passed in the 1960s, remember?
No,
During
curfew.
the race riot, and curfew. And of course, curfew were also passed.
Right here in Durham. Go past this railing.
Well,
And black people couldn't serve on juries, could they?
no. That would not serve on juries. They took a U.S. Supreme Court decision to wipe that out. And scores of these were passed. Now, and the good thing about this is that even though you come up with a civil rights bill, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but when we come back in the next month, we're going to start with the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. Some people think that the very first Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964. The very first one was passed in 1866. 1866. Sweeping. And we'll talk about the 1875 Civil Rights Bill that was passed. And between 1875 and 1957, there were no bills passed. That is, civil rights bills passed between 1875 and 1957. But you'll find that the one in 1866 was very interesting. This is when the political showdown began between Johnson and the so-called radical Republicans. All right? See y'all next